Hello, my name is Arlene Sullivan, and I am honored to be your program host. This program, celebrating the 101st anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, has been a long time in the making. I don't just mean spending this summer pulling the details together, but the enormous amount of time courageous women spent fighting long and hard and at a great personal cost to have the right for women to vote become a reality. Something we all need to reflect on. In 1848, women and men met in Seneca Falls, New York, to advance the cause for women's rights. The convention, organized by Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt, marked the beginning of a formal women's suffragette movement. The men and women of the movement made speeches and petitioned Congress, pressuring government officials to recognize the women's right to vote. They started the movement and paved the way for future suffragists like Alice Paul, a New Jerseyan, to continue the fight. Alice Stokes Paul was an American Quaker, suffragist, feminist, and women's rights activist, and one of the main leaders of the strategists of the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibits sex discrimination in the right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." After the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, suffragists like Alice Paul knew their work was not finished. While the government recognized women's right to vote, many women still face discrimination. Women of color, immigrants, and lower-income women were often deterred from voting by laws and social pressure. For example, Native women were not considered U.S. citizens until 1924 and were not permitted to vote. Women who were convicted of a crime were also unable to vote, even if they completed their sentence. Alice Paul and other members of the National Women's Party drafted the Equal Rights Amendment. If ratified, the amendment would guarantee equal rights to all people, regardless of their gender. The Equal Rights Amendment was ratified by both houses of Congress in the 1970s. New Jersey was one of the first states to pass the ERA in 1972. But to date, only 38 states have passed the ERA. The fight for equality continues today to encourage state legislators to pass the ERA so it can be ratified to the Constitution. We are honored to have with us today Carol Simon Levin, a historian who specializes in telling the stories of fascinating women history forgot through first-person portrayals. Today, Carol will portray Alice Paul, a suffragist from New Jersey whose tireless efforts propelled women's suffrage past reluctant male voters and through state and national legislatures to the final success that is the 19th Amendment. And now I'd like to introduce Carol Levin as Alice Paul.
My name is Alice Paul, and as you have heard in some of these songs, it took over 7 decades of activism, including 480 campaigns in state legislatures, 56 state referendums, 47 attempts to add suffrage to state constitutions, and 19 campaigns for a federal amendment in 19 different Congresses to win women the right to vote, for women to finally have a voice in America's government. More than 2,000 brave women from my own National Women's Party picketed the White House. Over 500 were arrested, and I and 167 other women were jailed, some of us beaten and force-fed. In the end, on August 18, 1920, the hopes of generations of American women came down to one final nail-biting session of the Tennessee legislature and a 24-year-old male legislator who listened to his mother and voted for suffrage to win the vote for women. On August 26, 1920, 72 years since Seneca Falls Convention, 144 years since Abigail Adams famously urged that the men of the Continental Congress remember the ladies when they were drafting the laws for the new nation. The 19th Amendment, also known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was officially adopted, and women across the country finally had the right to vote. Or I should say, white women. Native Americans were not citizens and could not begin to vote until 1924, and some were still not voting until the early 1960s. Chinese Americans were denied suffrage till 1943, Japanese Americans till 1952. Southern states used literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers, including threats of bodily harm, to effectively prevent many African Americans from voting until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And despite the long struggle, the vote was only the first step. As I wrote in 1921, many of the laws against which the early convention protested continue to exist to the detriment and humiliation of women. Discriminations persist in the universities. Women are far from enjoying equality in the trades and professions. They are discriminated against by the government itself in the civil service regulations. They do not share in all political offices, honors, and emoluments. They have not attained complete equality in marriage or equal rights as married women over their property, or even in the matter of guardianship of their children. There is danger that because of a great victory, women will believe their whole struggle for independence is ended. They have far to go. In 1923, I wrote and introduced before Congress the Equal Rights Amendment, also known as the ERA. For the next 50 years, in addition to constant work on behalf of women's rights here in America and abroad, I advocated for that amendment to be added to the Constitution. We succeeded in getting it into the Republican Party platform in 1940 and the Democratic platform in 1944, but were opposed by many women's rights activists because they feared it would eliminate protective legislation for women. Finally, in 1972, a combination of resurgence, women's movement, and the support of the League of Women Voters enabled the amendment to pass overwhelmingly with bipartisan support in both chambers. Frustratingly, a 7-year ratification limit was added, the first time a time limit had been added to an amendment. At first, it didn't seem to matter. Within a year, the amendment was ratified in 30 of the 38 states needed. The tide turned when, under the leadership of Phyllis Schlafly, a homemaker turned public speaker and anti-ERA crusader, the public and the legislatures were fed scare tactics about co-ed bathrooms and other horrors. Ratification slowed and then stopped altogether. I died in 1977, my life's work incomplete. For decades, the fight for the ERA seemed over. However, this past January, Virginia ratified the amendment, technically the last state needed. A date extension has already passed the House, but the U.S. Senate has refused to take up the bill. Looking back on the long fight for women's equality started by our brave foremothers 172 years ago in 1848, I like to quote the words of Carrie Chapman Catt, the last president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the first president of the League of Women Voters. Writing after the final ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920, she stated, "It is doubtful if any man ever realized what the suffrage crusade came to mean to American women before the great victory was achieved. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not yet born when it began. Suffragists who had forged the first links died before it ended. The vote is your emblem of equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling you to make no pause. Act. To which I add, vote, advocate, support candidates, run for office, It is up to each and every one of us to carry on the struggle for true equality.
We reached out to recently retired Senator Weinberg, and she graciously offered these words. Thank you all so much for inviting me to this celebration. I'm sorry I could not be with you today to celebrate this important milestone in the fight for women's rights. On the 101st anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, we must remember that the fight for equal rights continues more than a century later. There is much work left to do in order to achieve equal rights for all women, including minorities, and our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. As we fight for women's access to health care, equal pay for work, and more, we remember the fight to pass the 19th Amendment. We celebrate the aspiration of women's equality as it is necessary to achieve a just state and a just nation. Thank you again, and I encourage all of you to exercise your right to vote in the upcoming election and keep your voices heard. I am personally grateful to all the women who have gone before us, who struggled to make the road easier for us. I like to think I'm carrying on for them in some way. I'm a candidate for the mayor of Wayne, and I'm asking you for your support. We have a chance to make history here in Wayne. I will become the first woman elected as mayor for a full term. A mayor must never forget that she is a public servant, and as such, she needs to listen. It may be a dying art, but it's invaluable. Our voices need to be heard and be a part of the decision-making process. This is achieved by creating an environment of transparency, accountability, and respect. I am asking you to exercise your hard-won right to vote in person at the polls or with mail-in ballots. I ask that you vote for me, my team, and Row A. Remember, when women vote, women win. Let's make history in Wayne. Thank you, and please feel free to share this event with others.